Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Shane Leaning, who is based in Shanghai and specializes in strategic leadership for international schools. Shane's work and his book, titled Change Starts Here, co-authored with Ephraim Lerner, was born from a critical realization that much of the professional development that schools engage in does not lead to sustainable change. We explored the book's core philosophy, which focuses on empowering schools to lead change internally. Shane explained how their inquiry-based dialogic approach, framed around 40 community-facing questions and structured by a double diamond model, which consists of connect, discover, define, align, develop, learn, deliver, and sustain, is designed to combat a death of organizational confidence and to get to the heart of what the school community truly needs. We talked about the importance of cultivating psychological safety and whether real change is possible without the readiness to surface the tensions, talk about mistakes, and ensure every staff member feels truly heard. We also talked about the challenging ethical and financial dilemmas faced by PD providers like ourselves, who struggle to get schools to commit to the long-term intensive work, like organizational coaching, that's needed for change to actually stick. I always enjoy talking with Shane, and we'll link to a previous conversation we published here in July, where he led the discussion that was focused on how to have more nuanced conversation and was first published on his podcast. I also wanted to mention that we did record the video for this, and I will be publishing it on our YouTube channel. So if you are one of those folks who enjoy watching podcasts instead of just listening to them, you can find that on the Thought Stretchers Education YouTube channel. As always, I encourage you to check out our website, where you'll find our professional learning options and offerings. That website is wegrowteachers.com. You'll also find our blogs and this podcast there. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or things you'd like to express to me, my email address is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And with that, here is my conversation with Shane. I am with Shane Leaning, not to be confused with learning, but I think he actually has a URL that probably forwards to shaneleaning.com or something like that. But Shane and I have talked before, and I think it was on your podcast or whatever you call it. We're going to talk about his new book called Change Starts Here. What if everything your school needed was right in front of you? I'll hold it up here since I am recording video for this episode, or at least maybe to be published. But Shane, good to see you again. Welcome to the podcast. Why don't you give the listeners a little bit of a rundown of who you are, what you do, and what's important about you?
Thanks so much, Drew. And it's thank you so much for inviting me on. So I'm Shane Leaning, correct, not Shane Learning. I wish I was Mr. Learning. I'm sadly not. In fact, you'll notice my co-author is Ephraim Lerner. So, we're both one letter away from actually being learning.
Oh, I didn't even realize that. That's funny.
Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Leaning and learner.
Exactly. I'm based in Shanghai in China. I was a teacher, then turned senior leader, ended up working in system level leadership across a group of schools, and now work as an organizational coach. And by that, I mean working with school leadership teams and school communities on change leadership, essentially, and strategic leadership in their schools. So I work with a lot of international schools, especially out here in Asia, because that's where I'm based, but internationally too, on how they can lead with a bit more confidence, with a bit more community as well, and to lead really sustainable change. That's what I'm about, and that's what I'm really passionate about as well. I know when I first got into the professional development world, I used to go around schools a lot teaching English as additional language strategies. So I would like help a lot of schools with that. And I was loving it at first. I thought this is great, and I was getting good feedback, and everyone was like, "Yeah, Shane, good workshop, really enjoyed it." I felt like there was a good buzz, and I was kind of riding that way for a while until I had a bit of a wake up moment when I reapproached one school about a year after I'd done the training and asked them, how's it going? And nothing had changed in their practice, not one thing. And I actually found that across a lot of my engagements, and it got me really curious about this idea, of how do we create sustainable change in schools? And that's kind of the driver behind a lot of what I do right now.
Yeah, that is a fundamental problem, and as folks will know, and as I think I do professional development. We do professional development, thought structures, education, and how do you make it sustainable? How do you make it last and stick and grow? And some of the things that that you write about in the book are certainly meant to do that. So before we get into that, so first of all, what did you teach? And then also, what was your schooling like as a kid? How would you describe or characterize it?
So both of those are linked, actually, because the first job I taught, the school I taught at, was the school I attended also,
Nice.
also as a child. So what was my schooling like? I think it was okay. But bar a couple of teachers where I had these really transformational experiences. So I was pretty shy as a kid, painfully. I think my parents thought I'd probably need some professional help. But when I got to secondary school, I had a music teacher who kind of, shoved a trumpet, in my mouth and said, play that and join the band. And that became my little escape place in the school, and eventually developed my social skills from there, and it kind of really saved me. That teacher really paid a lot of attention to me in that way, and even helped me break through a lot of barriers. Like, for example, I come from a working class background. We didn't have too much money growing up, and an underprivileged community. And when we left school in the UK at 16, you can leave school and go to a sixth form college, like for the last 2 years. Even though at school I achieved an A in music, which is like top grade for music, I was not accepted into my local sixth form college. And they said, for the music course, and he said, well, an A in music is one thing, but you don't really understand what it's like. And there was a big classist conversation going on there about where I came from. Anyway, this teacher, my old music teacher, she stormed into the sixth form center and wrote quite a few worded letters. Anyway, I did end up getting on the course. I never got on quite well with the teacher on that course, but I did get on, and I think that really spurred me on. And interestingly, later when I left university, I left uni, and there was a music teacher, my old music teacher, she was going on maternity leave. And there was this kind of temporary teaching position, and I went to stand in the shoes of the music teacher who meant so much to me. And that started me off in my career. So I started off as, I like to say, an unqualified music teacher, because I had no qualifications, no teaching qualification. And at the time, on shortage subjects in the UK, you can recruit unqualified teachers into that. And that's how I got into it.
Wow. I don't think you and I have discussed this, but I also played the trumpet in grade school and middle school into high school. Yeah.
There you go. We need to have a jam together. Although my trumpet is like dusty in a corner of a room, terrible.
Well, it's been many years since I don't even have a trumpet anymore. I played a little piano, taught myself a little bit more of that than I had basic lessons, but then got more interested in the guitar, and some folks might see behind me, I've got my guitars, and ended up teaching myself how to play guitar, and played in a band and wrote some songs, and that was fun. So But that's for a different podcast. So you mentioned a few things about it, but the book again, Change Starts Here. Anything more important or other important things to say, like, what's the book about? What's the impetus and maybe the elevator pitch for it, building on the things that you've already said.
Yeah. So if I was to go back into, one of my last role where I worked in a system level role, working with lots of schools in that kind of regional capacity, I was noticing that like there was always an urge to push initiatives into schools from the outside. We always had an urge, or to bring something in to save a school. Let's push things in. And yet the times where I was seeing our schools most successful is when they really had clear ownership over their own vision and their own mission, and we were there able to kind of offer support into their journey. And this kind of got me interested in this idea of organizational change and how we empower schools to really lead change for themselves. And I kind of got together with the co-author of the book, Ephraim, and we talked a lot. He was at the time talking a lot about community-led change and the importance of engaging a community in change. And at the time, I was talking a lot about too many people being involved in schools and schools looking outwards far too soon. I was worried about what I was seeing was this death of organizational confidence in schools, where schools were becoming over-reliant on products, or over-reliant on consultants, or even over-reliant on policies that were guiding their decisions rather than being guided by what they knew was to be right within their community. And that gave birth to the book, really. We thought we thought, can we embark on a journey to figure out a few questions or a bit of a process that schools might be able to think about to empower them to lead change confidently for themselves, not excluding externals, because they're important, and of course me and you work in that sector, but engaging them at the right time and in the right way.
Yeah. Well, it's a timeless problem, and one of the things I mentioned to you before was appreciate the use of inquiry. Of course, I'm an inquiry advocate, and you've got 40 questions that you've used to frame this, and some of the things that I want to dive in there. Some that I thought were maybe worth talking about, at least from my perspective and my context. But you also, you mentioned a few other folks, and one of them several times, Jim Knight and his work, and a lot of folks will know his work in the coaching and instructional coaching world. I assume, I don't know Jim's work. I've had him on the podcast before. How much does he get into the leadership piece versus instructional coaching?
Yeah, so Jim's work, I mean, is of course predominantly in the instructional coaching world, but a lot of what we've took from Jim, and he kindly read the book and endorsed it as well, is that he is a master conversationalist and a master at what he calls the dialogic approach, which is being able to say, okay, we'll have a conversation about this. I'm not just going to facilitate your ideas. There is some expertise here, but the expertise will only ever be offered in, never directed in. And so we've taken a lot of that philosophy and that dialogic approach to how a school might engage with externals and how a good relationship might be, not to cut out externals and say we've got this and we don't need anyone's help and we don't need to engage in the conversation, but to say, actually, we understand ourselves better than everyone else, but you've got a framing to offer us. We just know at what point we just need to know at what point to engage with that, and you need to know as a consultant how to have a dialogical process with us. You don't know our school better than us, but you do know your thing better than us. So we need to have a dialogical process, and that's a lot of where kind of Jim Knight's work has been very influential for us in the book, and a lot of the work we do with our not-for-profit, which is Work Collaborative, where we try to support some of these ideas.
Yeah, that sort of cognitive coaching model, I think, and I don't know if you would describe it this way. I would imagine you at least would describe it at least similarly, but it strikes me as kind of an inquiry approach, right? It is leading people's thinking with not necessarily questions, but questions are one way to do that. There are phenomena, there's data, there's things you can put in front of people that get them to think and go, I hadn't thought of it that way, or that makes me think of this. And I would say shamelessly stretch the thoughts, right? But you've got 40 questions. The first one, when was the last time you felt truly heard? And one of the things that I highlighted was the idea of proactive inquiry. So being genuinely curious, listening with empathy, and valuing what others share. Is there anything more that is useful to say about that idea of proactive inquiry?
Yeah, and by the way, I like I do totally agree with your framing. I like the idea that it's an inquiry process. Yeah, the questions in the book are all about inquiry, yes, and forcing you to be community facing in a lot of your approach. So it's about getting you to really dig around in your organization and dig around within your systems, within your community, to work out, do you actually know the answers to some of these questions, and to constantly challenge your assumption. So in our whole model, we constantly talk about this idea that every change starts with a perceived challenge, and the goal, through ideally going through the book and the question approach, or the double diamond, which is a model that we use from design thinking, is trying to constantly interrogate that perceived challenge to work out, where is it just a perception, and where are the other perceptions, and what do those perceptions join together to truly mean for your organization? Because in so many organizations and schools are very uncomfortable with actually challenging those initial perceptions, and so often those perceptions are just turned straight into goals. And that's the idea, I guess. That's the inquiry approach. It's inquiring into that perception and trying to expand that. That's what the questions attempt to do.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the double diamond. So you've got the perceived challenge, which is where it starts, and kind of going left to right. So connect and discover being the first stage, then define and align, which brings you to community goal, which is, I don't know if it's the second stop along the train there. Then you get into develop and learn, and then deliver and sustain. And of course, the third stop, and probably not fair to say is the final stop, but a more final stop, is a sustained solution.
Yes.
So you mentioned, the idea of challenge and challenges. And one of the things that I think is, as you mentioned, important, and I highlighted here, is not avoiding disagreements, but developing the skills to navigate them productively. Dialogic, we were talking before we hit record, and are we debating, or are we having discourse, are we trying to figure out what's true, what's not true, how true is it, and which I think is essentially one of the aims of inquiry-based learning, is that we develop learners who have some sort of skepticism and looking to figure out, is this true? How is this true? How might it be true? In what cases might it be true or not true? And those kinds of things. But there's a culture and some skills that go with being able to disagree in ways that are productive. So maybe there's, can you say more about how you work with teachers in school, or not teachers necessarily, but leaders, and maybe teachers and educators to sort of refine and cultivate those skills?
Yeah, you're totally right to label it. When we disagreeing well is an absolute skill, and it's a skill that needs some deliberate practice to get right. And so we draw a lot of inspiration from the work of Amy Edmondson on the idea of psychological safety, like creating psychological safe spaces. And Amy Edmondson's research which was brilliant when she talks about in her book, in The Fearless Organization, that when she was working with hospitals at the time and surgeon teams, and she was trying to find what led to the most success overall, and she ironically found that the teams that were reporting more mistakes were the teams with higher success rates than the teams who were reporting less mistakes. And the reason for that was not because they were making more mistakes. It's because they were honestly talking about their mistakes rather than hiding it. And if you don't talk about those mistakes, you're going to probably make more because you're not willing to talk about that safely. And from a very early stage, Ephraim and I, we've got this wonderful working relationship where we are able to challenge each other, and we try to model that together and to really work through quite complex, challenging things. And we run an organization together, and that comes with its challenges. We wrote a book together, that came with its challenges, and tried to kind of model that safety. And I think one of the ways you do that is by asking some uncomfortable questions very early on in your relationship and in your process. And this is why, very purposefully, we structured that. Certainly some of the first 5 questions in the book, but definitely the first half of the questions, a lot of them are about surfacing where tensions might naturally fall within a relationship. So that first question you mentioned, which is, when did you last truly feel heard, is a question to provoke within a team. Do we actually listen to each other, or do people think they're listening to people, and actually people don't feel listened to? You know, the classic that happens in schools, right, is death by 1,000 surveys. Like, we as leaders go, okay, we're hearing you, we're sending the surveys out, and yet sometimes you can then take a pulse of staff and they still say, even though they're surveyed all the time, that they're not feeling heard. Why are they not feeling heard? Because maybe you're not reporting back on it, or maybe actually it's an emotional feeling. Maybe they're going, yeah, well, I did say this in this survey and something got acted on, but no one's actually come into my classroom and asked me how I am. And that means something to me. And so it's really important at the start of a change process to ask this question, because people might tell you the way that they want to be heard, or the way that it's meaningful for them to be heard. And that is going to help you along down the line of any change to be able to work out, is this change working? Am I getting accurate feedback? And ultimately, this is so important because most change fails. Most change in any organization, schools, absolutely. Most change doesn't work. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I would definitely say one of the big reasons is people not communicating properly, which usually is from a lack of psychological safety.
Yeah, and I would say another way to say that might be, or at least related conceptually, is the trust, right? Do you trust that this person is? I think I saw a video just this morning of you. I think probably from the Festival of Education, where you were talking. It was just a quick blurb. I think between competence and character. And that character is, I think, highly related to the trust piece, right? Does this person have integrity? Are they, do they have the same values? Are they going to undercut you on all of those kinds of things? And some of that is how you talk with people, how you engage with them, some of that proactive inquiry, right? Are you authentically interested in what they have to say and think, even if you might disagree? And that's an important caveat, right? I worked with a principal when I was a teacher, and lots of good things to say about him. But I remember, he used to basically say things like, in staff meetings, the answers are in this room. What he really meant was, the answers are in this room, and I'm going to let you talk until you say what I want to hear, so that I can just say, yeah, see, there it is, And if you're, it's a bit of a sleight of hand, but at some point you go, okay, I'm not sure that I trust this person. And, that's a big piece. Do we have clarity on what their direction is, what their thinking is? Can we disagree in ways that are productive? And I think that's a really important piece. We talk about that with teachers and building on the work of, I'm just drawing a blank on it, the PLC it'll come to me in a moment. He's passed away many years ago. But the sort of sets of questions, but teachers are generally cynical about new initiatives and PD and all kinds of things. And they're right to be, because things come and go and all of that kind of thing. But if you can include them in that conversation and show some of the thinking, they might disagree with it, but a lot of them, at least, I think, even the ones that are not necessarily in agreement, will say, okay, I'll try it, because I can see that there's been some thoughtfulness here, and some of that transparency and communication. So there's not really a question there, other than just sort of responding.
Well, I like your response, because it actually it really highlights a point about when you bring people in and a change. And you hinted there about if people are involved early enough in your thinking. Now, we would conceptualize this in our double diamond. If you were to think of the double diamond process, the first diamond is all about getting from a perceived challenge, turning that into a goal. The second challenge is about turning that goal into a solution. Now, what a lot of people do is they take a challenge and they instantly turn that into a goal, like instantly. And then they instantly turn that into a solution. So if I was to take an example of a school who was implementing a new phonics program, like a science or reading program, and they said, okay, reading scores are low in this year group, and so we're going to implement a new phonics program, and this is the phonics program we're going to implement. Okay, I need to get you on board. If you go through that process that quick, then what you're going to have to do is you are going to have to engage in what you call buy-in, like generating buy-in. That's the term that we use. And that means that you're going to have to use all the capital you've stored, as much as you have, to try and literally buy people into this idea, because you've decided it. You just need to get them on board. And that is, I mean, apart from being very inefficient, like that is just tiring work to try and do that. So our idea is, well, what if you brought people in earlier? Instead of bringing people in after you've set your goal, can you get people involved in understanding what goal you're working towards? So if you're saying reading scores are low, would it not be more helpful to say, community, here's what the data is showing. What does this mean to you? Are you seeing this? Does this mean the same thing to me as it does to you? Are you as worried about this as I am? Have you got any explanations for why this is happening? And if they go, yeah, there is something, then they go, well, what kind of goal could we create together? What do you think could be the possible goal here? Not what solution, but what could be the goal? Well, the goal might be about, okay, we need some type of to improve reading scores with a reading intervention, or it might be that we actually need to look at some of the socioeconomic factors of the student, because we think that might be it. We might investigate in different ways, but once you've aligned on that goal together, then it's going to be much easier when you go into a solution. If they've already aligned and the community say, yeah, we have got a decoding problem with reading, that's we all agree that children are not able to sound out their words very well, then when you come along to pitch that phonics program, well, you're going to have a damn easier time. You're not going to have to generate the buy-in so much, because people go, well, yeah, I kind of get that. I get where you're coming from.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to, so question 9 I had circled, and this is in the discover stage. Are we actively seeking other views? And there's a risk there. And I think lots of leaders, school leaders and otherwise, might push back and or at least wonder and say, Well, here's the problem. If I bring in these other views, how do I keep on the track that I think is important? And so there's a tension there, right? We talk about, sort of clarifying that mission and purpose, and then what's that vision look like? What does it sound like? What's the evidence that we would want to see? And then what are the actions that we would want to do? And then let's critique those things. But I think that can be really helpful. But there is a risk there in sort of democratizing and or maybe even some might describe it as sort of flattening that sort of hierarchy of power, because we do want to make sure that we're not watering things down, that we're staying on course, and that can easily happen when we engage in actively seeking other views. So how do you think about resolving that tension?
Yeah, and it is a tension, although I would say we're sometimes talking about different types of change. So we've kind of advocated for this double diamond model, which is quite a slow model of change. It's very suited to kind of slow strategic changes. You've got your experience and a demographic shift that's coming into your schools, and you want to figure out what to do about that. This kind of is going to be suited to taking you through that change. But there's going to be some changes that are like hurricanes through your door that you need to act on. Or there are going to be some COVID was a perfect example. Or there's going to be some changes that are policy mandated from the local education bureau that you have to kind of go in. So yeah, in those changes, really, like, a good leader is not going to, if you already know you have to do something, then going to ask other people for their views is going to cause chaos. So I think you have to separate what type of change you're looking for. The reason we actually wrote a book about change, and even though there's a lot of books on change out there, is because many of the change models that exist, for example, one that I work with a lot is John Cotter's change model. I don't know if you know it, Drew. This is a 8-step change model, classic change model in the change space, which is all about going from an idea, like this is what we want to do, and then how do we go from what we want to do into action. So that starts from having a clear vision of what we want to do, and then it's all about engaging, generating buy-in, creating small wins so that people feel energized, and it's kind of building on that. It's a really, really great model if your only option is to start with the thing you need to do. You need to roll out this thing, your only choice. So I would always say, if you know what it is that you need to do and you have to do it, then do not go through the double diamond of change. You're just going to frustrate people along the way. That would not be the time to engage. But if you know that this is a change that you think you want to embed long term, it's not because of a quick policy shift, but it's about strategic thinking, a lot of especially changes around the mission, the vision of your school, or around big things you want to implement that have a bit of a longer term time scale, then invest that time going through a process like this. Cotter would not be the best model in that space, and that's why we created this book, for that kind of longer term thinking of change if you're going through that whole process. Although we say quite a few times in the book, it's not really, the reason we even framed it as questions rather than saying do this, do this, do this, do this, is because we've acknowledged that your change is going to be yours anyway. Very few changes are linear. And follow in that way. So actually, our hope is that some of the questions from the book become part of your vocabulary for change. And actually, you might be going through one change and just go, do you know, there was a question there in change that's here that I think would be really pertinent to ask at this stage, and that would be helpful. We don't have to go through the whole change process.
So the one of the things that pops up and surfaces in the pedagogy wars is expertise and inquiry and explicit instruction, those kinds of things. And I think there's a sort of parallel here, at least in some ways. I'm curious how often you sort of come across this, because there is another tension of expediency versus that slow process, right? And just like in an inquiry-based kind of classroom, or doing project-based learning, where there's not as much of a clarity of like, do this to get those points, or those kinds of things. We might have students say, can you just tell me, and I did when I was teaching that way, some students who are used to that more traditional model say, just tell me what I need to do. How do I get an A? That kind of thing. And so, well, we're working this differently. This is a different process. You might also have leaders, school leaders, and maybe even teachers, and maybe even community members to say, Shane, just tell me what to do, right? Like, you have expertise. You've been to all these schools. And just tell me what to do, right? I mean, do you ever do that, or how do you balance that tension?
So I would usually try to point people to their past initiatives, and try to do an exploration of how many of their initiatives over the last 10 years have actually stuck, and how many things have actually sustained change, and how many things they have started again, how many schemes of work they've been through, how many different changes have they had, and interrogating why. Because often what you find is they go, well, that program finished, well, that's because that member of staff left, and then that we did this thing, it didn't really work, it left a bad taste in the mouth, so we just left it there, or this one angered our parent body, so we had to make a pivot. So there's all sorts of reasons, and the reality is, we know that's, McKinsey did a big study in organizations, 70% of change across sectors, fail. 70% of change fail. I would predict much higher in the education space. I would be betting that 80% plus of change in schools fails. And I think that is my usual response, is to go, well, you can say, but we just need to do it, and tell me how to do it. And I just kind of go, well, how's that working for you? How's that worked for you in the past? Because as a sector, and as just across the world, that model of change, even though we keep doing it again and again and again, it has such a high failure rate that we would not accept in other fields. We would not accept 70% failure in so much of what we do. Why do we accept it in change? So, and the sad thing is it's because it presents an uncomfortable truth that we have to slow down, and that we have to moderate our judgment, and that means that is genuinely fearful for leaders, because they've got so much to do, and this change is just one of the changes that they're going through, and they're cognitively overloaded. They've got to crack on, but in my mind, and the research would say, we don't really have an alternative. We need to lean into this kind of slower thinking if we're to hope of having a better chance. And like a good example, I would say, would be it would work on both counts, because I've seen this. So I know Catherine Birbal-Singh, she's been on your podcast with the Michaela School in the UK. I also had the privilege of speaking to her on the pod too, and we talked about leadership on the pod. But like her Michaela School, there is no doubt that is a successful school, and she has crafted something very successful within her school community, and they have set their goals, and they have had a level of autonomy to create something really quite special and transformative that works for them in their little part of London, in their school. And that has been because their whole community has gotten behind a vision, and they've iterated, and they've scoped out, and they've been very slow and methodical about how they formed this, and then they're working together as a community with their vision. The problem is, people go, great, look at the Michaela School, great, they are achieving such, let's lift that, and let's go put that in our international school in the middle of Shanghai.
Right.
What are you doing? Like, that is not, that is just not, you are moving it into a totally different context. And we know that, and yet we still search for those easy fixes. I would argue the success of Michaela is about that strength of vision and that strength of community moving forward together, not necessarily because of their curriculum model or their teaching approach. And I've seen it replicated in schools around the world where they have such a clear sense of vision Last week I was in Bali, Green School Bali, about as opposite to Michaela as you can get, and they are achieving incredible things under a totally different model. But they have a clear vision on what they're doing. It's sustainability, and they're exploring around that, and they've got clarity as a whole community. Their parents, the students, their teachers, the leaders. They've got alignment. I think that is the most key.
Yeah, that again, as I emphasized earlier, that sort of clarity of mission and vision, and we talk about that. And when we work with project-based learning, schools on project-based learning, we want to make sure that we're clarifying that and that everybody knows. And in what ways is it, causing friction for that, or maybe greasing the wheels for that kind of thing. And when you were talking, it reminded me again, same thing with instruction, and in my sort of eternal dialogue, and some want to be debating about
which I love,
inquiry or explicit instruction or whatever. But Dylan William, I think, said something like, everything works somewhere, but nothing works everywhere. And I think that's really true. And so we want to think about things as heuristics and think about things that we can use, but then say, well, if we want to say that we really like what Michaela is achieving, and I agree with you, I think they're very successful at what they're trying to achieve. There are schools and communities that may want to achieve some different things. Therefore, yes, the things that they would do would be a different alignment. But if you say, well, we really like that, but then, so asking the hard questions of, so what might work, what of that model might work here in Bali or in Kentucky or wherever, but what wouldn't, and what do we need to take into account? What are the factors that are going to be headwinds and which are going to be tailwinds, and do we want the same outcomes? Are those the things that our community wants? And having those conversations, but those are really hard to do sometimes because they do take time. They're sort of resource heavy, right? They're time heavy. And those, one of the questions that I had is about sort of necessary conditions for doing change well and for running schools well. You mentioned sort of clarity of vision, but I imagine there's some other things, and that's really challenging here in the States, and I think elsewhere as well. You've got a shortage of teachers, you've got just so many challenges and issues that schools are facing, perhaps more so post-COVID, but those make it really hard. So, what are some of those necessary conditions, and what do we do when those things aren't in place?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think there's a number of conditions, aren't they? So we might talk about psychological safety conditions, we might talk about community conditions or structural conditions, resource conditions. There's so many different conditions to helping a change go right. But I would say one of the fundamentals is about your community goal being the most important thing to get right and get aligned on. Like, what are we trying to achieve before we look elsewhere? And the reason I say that is we could stay on the idea that let's say you're a school leader and you've just visited the Michaela school and you've just gone, wow, that's amazing. And then you could come back to your school and you could think it's fair to say, let me tell you everything that was great about it, and then let's do what you said. We'll talk about what was good, what was bad, what could work for us. You could do that. But my God, if you're doing that for every good thing you see out there in the world, it's just going to be exhausting. It's going to tire your staff out. Everyone is going to get worn out by the conversation. And often when I go into schools where they say, we don't have time for conversation around what to do, Shane, because we just don't, we're burnout, this and that. Often what they're actually saying, when we dig in, and I do a lot of digging in schools, it's one of my favorite things to do, spend a bit of time, is I actually find that they have been looking at far too many things before they even knew what they wanted to achieve. This is like a really common problem in schools, is that we have this kind of magpie syndrome where we're just like shiny things around us. And then we try to be good leaders and we try to bring that in and model it back to our staff and have these great discussions with staff about the value of these things, when actually we've taken a step far too soon looking outwards. And what we should be doing is saying, let's just close the blinds just for a little bit. Let's just close the blinds for a little bit and just try to understand, who are we and what are we trying to achieve? And then once we've got a bit of clarity in that, and we might need to take some time to get that, let's generate some filters that when something approaches our school or when we approach something else, we look at it and we go, well, this is our goal. Did what I see feel like it would contribute towards that goal? If yes, then maybe we should have a conversation. But often you will find if you've got a goal in place already, then those things might filter away a little bit more easy. And you might be able to go, okay, do you know what? That is not the thing for us, because I know my goal. I know my goal well. So it's always difficult, because one of the first things you go to when you're working with schools is the idea of resources and political climate and all the challenges that prevent a school from doing change well. And they are real, no doubt they are real. But often what I try to do when working in a school is go, yeah, they are real, and often we can't change them. So they're real, and that's where we find ourselves within. Let's look at, it's kind of that Buddhist philosophy of what what can we change within here. And actually you'll find there's quite a lot of shuffling we can do inside that just make our interaction with those external challenges that little bit lighter. And that's where we should be putting our focus, not at trying to control the floodgates.
Yeah, well, it's, as you mentioned, some of the things that, and I mentioned some of the things that make it hard for schools to do sustainable change, churn. You have people leaving, you have those political countervailing forces, you have all the things. As a professional development provider, sometimes I wish that I could have more contact with the teachers and even the leaders, but oftentimes we go long stretches between having much contact or conversation or visits or things like that, and for some good reason, right? It's logistically challenging, it's financially challenging. They're asking for our services, but we're not there every day or every week. How do we one of the challenges is, how do we keep keep that work going, right? How do we continue, if you're working with the leader and you're saying, these are some of the things that I want you to, or I suggest that you practice or think about, or whatever those things might be, and then you come back, let's say 6 weeks later or 6 months later or a year later, then some of it's been done, none of it's been done, all of it's been done. How do we, I guess, how do you navigate that because it can be frustrating, right? It's like, we know that it takes intensive work, but we don't have that opportunity to do the intensive work.
Yes, and that speaks to the whole ethical relationship between, I think, PD provider and school as well. And it's one that I've had a few debates about with a few different people online, especially on what responsibility do professional development providers have to the outcomes. And of course, like in one sense, you can say, well, you can't hold a PD provider because they're not implementing it. So you can't hold them accountable to the outcomes. It's a school that's responsible. And while I agree with that, I also think we have an issue where it's too easy for a PD provider to provide their specialism without understanding of organizational change science and how organizations actually change. And therefore they might be delivering great stuff, but it's not actually working on the ground. So there's a few things kind of we're working on Work Collaborative, which is, can we create a framework to help providers implement well in schools? Like, can we give them the tools? Can we give a framework for schools to engage providers in a better way? Like, maybe that's actually, there's more we can do on the school side. They engage with many providers. Can we help them have a framework, a lens to view their relationship with the providers on what kind of questions to ask them, how to ensure they're getting sustainability? And in my own little way, like with my practice, when I'm working with a school now, like I'm very committed to not little things like not doing one-off trainings with schools, because we need more than that. So I always make sure, for training now, we need a decent chunk of time before where I get to know you as best I can, and we're going to have a decent chunk of time afterwards to debrief, and a bit of coaching conversations that come in a couple of regular slots after we meet, where I can check in and ask you questions and clarify what the implementation challenges are and help you kind of work through those to give you that better chance of implementing well.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt there's PD providers out there that are happy to do one-offs and that kind of thing, and certainly not something that we want to do, but it's a real challenge, right? So and I'm sure that's part of the conversation that you've had. We have a school, I mean, sometimes we'll get a call and somebody says, we've got an hour session next week, what can you do for us? That, which is just laughable, right? But oftentimes, as much as I want to, and I say to teacher or to the leaders that I'm talking with, saying, how do we make this sustainable? What are some of the things that we can do? And they say, well, we don't have the budget. All we have is this. And so as a PD provider, do we turn that down? And that's a real challenge. It's challenge financially. You might say, well, okay, we'll do this and then see, hopefully it'll lead to something more, but oftentimes it doesn't, and that's a real challenge.
I would really like to see, and I think this would be deeply challenging for us providers, and many providers would probably not want to see this research, and probably would not be very transparent. But I would be very curious, and I think I could predict if we were to take some of the biggest providers going. So let's just imagine a provider that is providing some kind of teaching techniques, kind of like, or cognitive science or something like that. They're providing these techniques and teaching people how to do it well. And I would love to see some studies that actually look at overall the interactions that they have with schools. And I know, like, some of these kind of organizations that have thousands of schools that subscribe to their product. I want to know not about those ones that are being successes and that they talk about all the time and that they have the closest relationships with, because they have key people inside who are telling them how it's going. They've got those advocates. I want to know, on average, across every school that subscribes, what is the average success rate in that? I am willing to hedge my bets that over 50% do not achieve any results from some of those programs. I am willing to bet on that. And I think that should be making us look really hard at ourselves, at a sector that is so challenged for budget. Nowhere more true than in the US right now, but in the UK and many countries around the world, where we are feeling our public education systems are underfunded, that we have to have a serious conversation about how impactful is the money that is flowing out of our school being for us. I think that has to be addressed.
Yeah, well, and as a PD provider, I think that's an important question as well, and it is challenging, and I'm certain, and I would guess you've probably had some of these examples as well, as where you're working with a school and all the best intentions, and then it just doesn't take for a variety of reasons. Some of it are on the front end where they're not willing to engage in a long-term sustainable, they can't, or they don't have it, or contractual reasons. I mean, there's a school I'm working with, and asking if teachers can do certain things on planning periods, and said, well, that's not really something they'll do because the contract won't allow for it. And like, okay, well, what are we doing here? A school in Las Vegas that we were deeply involved with, and then budget issues hit, and they weren't sure they were going to be able to buy pencils, let alone, do professional development. And you say, well, you should probably prioritize pencils, or those kinds of things, right? Yeah, it's such a real challenge, and it is an ethical challenge, right? And people are right to say, well, what are we spending our money on? Are these professional development providers, ourselves included, are we worth the money? And I think that's an important question to ask. Of course, the other part of that question is we don't have control over all of the variables and factors that we want. And if we could, it's sort of like a principal. My mom was a principal, and she suggested at one point I'd be a principal. And I said, "You're out of your mind." It's like people seem to think that principals have all this power and autonomy, and they can just make things happen. And they have so much less power and autonomy. They have the board, they have the parents, they have the students. Everybody's coming at them with what they should do, and they can't just snap their fingers and make things happen. But yet they're held accountable in many ways for those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So
I would
go ahead.
I would love to ask. I agree. I definitely do not think that we should now just all of a sudden be going after consultants and companies saying you need to act better. Like, that is definitely not my message. In fact, I stood on a stage once, giving a keynote, and someone said, "Oh yeah, you're Shane. You're the consultant who hates all other consultants." That's what they said to me. I was like, yeah, I see what you're saying there, but no, I don't believe that, and it does lie within that interaction point. But and there's a huge complexity in that. But what I would really like to see is for us to actually engage in a proper conversation where we can actually say, okay, how much do we spend on professional development? And what is our risk tolerance in terms of how much are we willing to spend, and let that money, not be impactful to get that small amount that is impactful? What is it like? Are we willing to waste 20%, 30%, 50%? Are we okay with 70%? Like, what is it like we're actually okay with? And if we've got a number in our head and we are not achieving anywhere near that, well, don't we want to have a conversation about how to make that better?
Yeah, the return on investment. I want to shift a little bit here. So question 28, what haven't we asked? And this is in stage 6 in the learn part, learn stage. So the way that I think about this is, what haven't we asked? What are the devil's advocacy questions? How do we bring in other perspectives? And, it's related to some of the things we mentioned before, but what if we have school leaders, and maybe this is the role of consultants like us, to form those questions, but what if we have school leaders that don't have that skill of asking those hard questions, or figuring out what else should we ask? What haven't we asked?
Yeah. I like that. So I would say 2 things. One, I do think it would be helpful to have a few more people acting in organizational coaching positions. Like, I think this comes down because I think schools should be asked questions in their change process. The problem is at the minute, actually, is I think coaching is fragmented in schools and not acting in this way. You often have maybe student coaching, that happening, or maybe you've got teacher coaching, instructional coaching, if you like, and then you've got like this big gap, and then all of a sudden you have leadership coaching or executive coaching where individual leaders get this kind of coaching. You may have team coaching around certain things. It's much less prevalent, but actually a lot of the time these coaching methods are fragmented and they're often achieving different purposes. And in fact, I've spoken to coaches who are coaching different people in the same organization, coaching different executives who all hate each other and actually want different things. And they're not, and they can see these patterns emerging, but as an ethical coach, they're not even allowed to help them connect the dots to each other because that would cross confidentiality boundaries. So like there's this huge problem. And I feel that sometimes actually utilizing a coaching approach, bringing someone from outside or having some people within your school who are trained to get involved into those conversations and safely ask some powerful questions can be can be really, really valuable, whether that be an external organizational coach or internal. But I would say secondly is that if you start to develop a culture of questioning early on in change, and you start to develop that psychologically safe culture where people feel like they can make mistakes and they can ask questions, and that actually, one of our questions in the book is, what will we do when we mess up? It's like, because like
I have it up here.
oh, there,
That's where
exactly.
my next question was.
Oh, well
Yeah.
lined
So how
up,
do we
Drew.
how do we empower that? That's what I wrote. How do we empower people to say, "Hey, I think we're on the wrong track here"?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the way you have to empower that is by having a strong theory of action and predicting what might go wrong, and then equally saying, when we mess up, which we will, how are we going to respond in this room to that? So let's just make, at the start of any change process, I think a useful conversation is to say, right, okay, we're just about to implement this new thing. We are going to make some massive mistakes as we go, and we are going to upset each other. There's going to be things. So what things might we do? And then usually in the room, people say, well, one person might storm ahead with an idea without informing the group. Great. What do we do in that situation? Let's talk that through now. Or someone else might say, well, one person could make a mistake and it's a big one, so they kind of try to cover it up. Okay, great. Okay, that could happen, because we might feel, what would cause them to do that? What would cause them to hide that? Okay, is it because, okay, it's because they're fearful that the group are gonna have an opinion on it. What can we commit to each other now to stop that happening? So actually having those conversations in advance and trying to predict that, yes, we're going to make mistakes, and what do we do if these different things happen, I think will be very useful for when you get to that moment and go, okay, we've messed up. We either have arrived at this moment with no training, and therefore all of our unconscious biases are going to come into play, all of our defenses are going to come up, and we're going to go into that mode, or we're going to have practiced this a little bit, we're going to have talked about it, and we might be able to go, hang on a sec, that thing's happening that we talked about. I think we should do this.
That reminds me, I was talking with a counselor about relationships, last year or something like that. And he said something like, the quality of a relationship isn't isn't best measured by like how things are going, how you respond when things are going well, but how do you respond when things don't go well? Because inevitably they won't.
Yeah.
And that reaction is what, sort of gets relationships off of a path of success and onto, toward divorce or whatever, that kind of thing. And that's a really interesting way to think about that. And I think there's an analogy here, right? How do we empower people, but how do we have clarity? How do we be transparent and say, we anticipate there's going to be problems, and we want to make sure that people are empowered to ask those hard questions and to be devil's advocate and to say, is this really working? Is it working in the way we want it to? Do we need to think about the change in our mission and vision? Maybe we were a little bit off on that, and asking those hard questions. But it's just such a challenge with all of the noise and churn and issues that so many schools are facing. And again, not a question there, just a sort of an observation.
Well, it speaks to the readiness of change, doesn't it? Like if I was to pick up my book and just kind of like flick to a page and just read out a question, I might say, oh, this question says, what is our gut feeling telling us? Or, what are we avoiding? These questions, if you've done no change preparation and you are cold in your team and you go in and say, what are we not talking about here, or something like that, well, you're going to be met with silence, or you're going to get one confident person, speak up. Like, it won't work. So don't go in with that. That's why we start the whole process of change with connect. It is our first word, and there's a reason for that. It's because you have to connect your team. You have to build something on connection, and that takes time to develop. Sometimes we would even say, you go into, I've been into organizations where they've been ready for a big change, and they said, okay, this is what we're trying to do, Shane, can you help us take us through that change? And actually, when we've done initial surveys of their staff, gotten in there and gotten into their community, we have realized, wow, there is a lot of distrust in this community, or this community have a lot of change trauma in the past. They have had experience some tough times. If we go into this change now, yeah, you might get a bit of success here, bit of success. We're not likely. I think we should maybe hold off on that change 6 months, a year, and work on connection. Everything is about connection this year, and then see if we're ready. And let's see if that can pay off a bit better. Let's make an investment now for that future. And that sometimes is where you need to stay for a while.
Yeah, and in many ways, it speaks to the importance of intellectual humility and scaffolding. The sort of what are they ready for? What is the school and the community ready for? Just like a student, right? We talk a lot about inquiry in our work, but if a student hasn't experienced and practice some inquiry skills, then asking them to do high level inquiry would be silly. But sometimes that happens, right? And so we want to take that same lesson and say, let's not just jump into this, into the deep end. We want to make sure that we're scaffolding and building the skills and the mindsets and all of that in the process. Well, I'm mindful of time. One last question, I think. I don't want to promise. I don't want to promise that it's the last question, but I think it might be the last question. How would you suggest school leaders use your book?
Very good question. There are a few ways you will use your book. Have a read through it and see what resonates with you first. We talk about resonance in the book, like the idea like something might resonate with you, and see what stands out to you. That would be a useful start. Our book, we purposely designed not to be a start to finish. So if you're wanting a start to finish change process, there are great models out there that for every change you would go step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, going through this. You might use the framework to kind of frame the work you do, and certainly I go through the double diamond in the work I do. But it wouldn't be that you go, okay, chapter 1, question 1. Let's ask this question in our first meeting, and then let's go through that. And
we've got to schedule 40 meetings, for 40 questions.
Exactly. Let's answer every question as a team together. That's not how. But I would say when you're heading into a change, if you read this book first, sometimes you might realize, okay, there's a need for me to slow down, or there might be a realization, hey, I'm not sure I'm involving my community enough here, or hey, I'm jumping in too fast with an external provider, and maybe this book can help me. And maybe this would be, I've already heard of leaders that they've already got this. It's only been out a few months, so it's lovely to hear feedback already, but some leaders that have already got it on their shelf, and they're saying, do you know what, Shane, already I've pulled it off my shelf a couple of times this year because I remembered reading it and there was that question, and I was like, we're at a tricky sticking point and we're trying to define a goal. So I'm just going to go to that define section and just look at those questions and see if they give me a prompt. Or I'm just trying to align my team around something, so let me just go there. Or we've just brought in a new system and we're trying to learn like what we what we need to do to get there. So I'm just going to go to that learn section and look at those questions. That can be a nice, useful way for you to dig into the book, I would say.
Well, like I said, I appreciate the use of questions, and as you well know, and listeners will well know, I'm a fan of inquiry. People will say that you should do the explicit instruction and then get into inquiry, but I think these are great examples. Obviously, it's not teacher-student, but it's a different, I think there's obvious parallels. You think about how you can use that question or those questions to then, as you say, so what do we need to know and learn? What are the things that are important for us to gain knowledge of, and who can I get that information from? Might be internal, might be external, might be both. And therein lies your sort of roadmap, and in using the inquiry piece, the questions to sort of frame the macro so that you can be sharp and smart and precise about the micro. And even in that micro, there might be moments, your coaching conversations with them where you're using inquiry methods to sort of push their thinking and pull their thinking and that kind of thing. So that I think is a brilliant mix. So what are the places and the links and things that they should go see and visit and that kind of thing? And anything else you want to mention before we sign off?
Yeah, well, you can get this book wherever you like, actually. I think it's in all good bookstores. So it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Waterstones, wherever you get your books from, you can find this, which is awesome. We've even managed to get it. I'm in China, and getting books is notoriously difficult in China, but luckily we went with a publisher that has an office here. So it's available here. So yeah, check out that. I guess if you're interested in the idea around the book, then going to workcollaborative.com would be a good place to start. It's also on there. It's got all the links to where you can get the book, but that explains a little bit about the philosophy and the movement behind Change Starts Here, the movement behind, helping schools lead good quality change for themselves. So that would be workcollaborative.com, a good place. If you want to find out more about what I do, it's shaneleaning.com, but you can go to shanelearning.com. I bought the domain, it redirects.
And I know we talked a little bit about social media. Where, if any places, should they find you?
Oh, we were talking about this before. So at the minute, my main hangout is LinkedIn. I think that's become the new main hangout. I still have an account over at X. I'm rarely there. I maybe check it once a week now. And I'm one of those people who's hanging on Blue Sky, but maybe next week it'll be gone. I don't know.
Yeah, I've struggled with Blue Sky. It feels a little bit too narrow and in scope and that kind of thing. But yeah, well, Shane, always a pleasure to talk. I'll hold up the book for folks who might be watching or assuming we publish this video. Change Starts Here. What if everything your school needed was right in front of you? Again, thanks for the conversation. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Drew. This has been an absolute honor.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.